Our guest today is Professor Liyakat Takim. He is the Sharjah Chair in Global Islam at McMaster University in Canada. A prolific writer and speaker, he has authored more than 140 scholarly works which have been published in various journals, books, and encyclopedias. His latest book, published by Oxford University Press, is called Shiism Revisited. The book assesses the possibility of an Islamic reformation in contemporary Shiism. Dr. Takim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to start today with talking about violence in the Quran. Now, violence is not one of the main themes in the Quran, but there are people who quote certain passages in order to try to prove that Islam is a violent religion. We'll look at some of examples from scripture later, but first we should note that there's a very long and very sophisticated tradition in Islam of scholarly commentary on the Quran. I think it's important for us to briefly discuss what approach Islamic scholars take to these and other passages in scripture.
First of all, let me say that it's a great honor and a pleasure to be here to talk about violence in Islam and in the Quran more specifically. It's important to note initially that there are two parts to the Quran itself. Those verses which are revealed in Mecca and those which are revealed in Medina. In Mecca, the verses which are revealed in Mecca, we find that they contain different themes like jogging the conscience, reminding human beings of their moral and social responsibilities, talks of social justice, and above all, reminds people of their accountability at the end of time, the hereafter, the presence of God, and so on. The verses in Mecca do not talk of violence, of jihad, or as it's called in the Quran, qital, which is fighting. It is only in Medina that the verses on violence appears. And this is significant to note, simply because it was in Medina that the Prophet himself formed an ummah, that is a community, and he had to respond to the hostility in Mecca or from Mecca. In other words, violence in the Quran is a response to Meccan hostility, not to be violent per se. In other words, violence has to be contextualized in the Quran. And this appears also in any scripture, not only in the Quran. If you look at the Old Testament, there is a lot of violence in the Old Testament, especially, perhaps more than in the Quran. But even then, it has to be contextualized within a particular historical setting. Similarly, in the Quran, but there are also passages which say, for example, chapter 8, that is your enemies, they offer you peace, then you must give them peace in return. Why? Because God does not love war. There are also passages which warn the Prophet Muhammad, وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا, meaning do not transgress, do not initiate hostilities. You are allowed to fight because they are fighting you, they are persecuting you, they are removing you from your homes. Obviously, when you are being fought against, you have to defend yourself.
There's a perception out there that scholars in Islam and Muslims in general read the Quran on a superficial level, but you're saying it's the opposite, that there's actually a tradition within Islam of reading the Quran in historical context.
Absolutely. Scholars, that is exegetes, commentators on the Quran, go through each and every verse in the Quran. And there are different strategies, different ways and approaches of hermeneutics, of approaching Quran. And there are those who go every verse by verse. And this has been a long scholarly tradition. It's nothing new. I'm writing on it, and I see very clearly that it dates back sometimes to the early 8th century, so within 50, 60 years after the Prophet's death, we find that, the 7th century, early 8th century, the exegesis, the Quranic commentary appears. And then, of course, they evolve through time. But basically what these do is to give us some kind of a context as to where and when a particular verse appeared, in what context, for what reasons. Now, of course, there's always differences of opinion, as there is in any exegetical or hermeneutical tradition. However, the key point is that scholars do examine verses, sometimes word to word. They'll look at the linguistic nuances, grammatical analysis, and of course, as I mentioned, the occasions or circumstances in which a particular verse was revealed. So in the case of the jihad verse, looking at the overall picture, they pick out certain verses and say, aha, kill them where you find them, means that we are allowed. People like Bin Laden, for example, or Zarqawi, what we call the fundamentalists. And again, these kinds of trends appear in all religious traditions. It's nothing new. Christian fundamentalists also will look at the Bible in isolation compared to other verses.
The verse that you quoted from there it's from chapter or surah number 2, verse 191, and it says, "Kill them wherever you find them." As an example of what it means to read the Quran in historical context, could you say something about the context of that verse?
Yeah, the context basically is, as I mentioned, the Meccan hostilities. In other words, people from Mecca who initiated hostility against the Muslim community, and therefore the Quran responds. But if you look further around that particular verse or the next verse, it talks of transgress, that you are allowed to fight because they are fighting you. And as I said, we cannot look at a particular verse in isolation. If you look at chapter 16, I think it's verse 22, I don't remember the exact verse, but I can find it for you if you like. It says, we are allowing you to fight because they are fighting you, because they have initiated hostilities against you. As I mentioned earlier, chapter 8, verse 61, if they offer you peace, you give them peace in return. So yes, kill them where you find them, but kill who and why and when? These are all essential questions that we need to answer.
Yeah, people who quote it out of context assumes that just automatically apply it to today and apply it to Jews and Christians.
First of all, this was not even applicable to Jews and Christians. Yeah. These verses were applicable to the polytheists, mainly Meccans who were attacking. Jews and Christians have got special status in Islam, as we are aware, the people of the book. So as long as they pay the tribute, what is called the jizya, which is a special tax, then they fought against tradition. They can maintain their own religion, their own culture, music, and so on. As long as, well, we all have to pay taxes, unfortunately, we don't like to, but they have a special tax because of but then they do not have to join the Muslim forces, for example. If they have extra burden, but they have extra privileges too.
One of the most important chapters in the Quran is chapter number 5. Could you say something about the historical context of that chapter and what that surah is talking about in terms of interfaith relations?
Chapter 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah, as it's called, is probably the last chapter that was revealed. We should also note that even in one chapter, the chapters in the Quran are not arranged chronologically. So you might find in one chapter, this is nothing to do with the Quran, is the way it was arranged after the Prophet's death. You find some verses may appear out of context of that particular chapter. Some verses in a chapter may be from Mecca. Sometimes they may be from a different occasion. Okay, so just because it is the last chapter does not mean that each and every verse was the last verse that was revealed. What I can say about chapter 5 is that it talks generally of the finality of prophecy, of the prophethood of Muhammad, that today we have perfected your religion. Now, was there a particular verse that you had in mind in that chapter?
The verses that are particularly interesting to me are the ones that talk about Jews and Christians and interfaith relations.
Yes. As I mentioned, Jews and Christians are people of the book. Muslims are not allowed to convert them. In fact, Muslims are not allowed to convert anybody forcibly, because the Quran comes with a clear message that the la ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion. Chapter 5, verse 48 also says that for every community we have given them their own laws. So you follow those laws, fattabi'ha. And then it goes on to say that you should compete in goodness. Don't compete in religion as to who is right and who is wrong. There are certain verses which talks of not taking Jews and Christians as friends. But again, you have to look at the context. It doesn't talk of all Jews or all Christians at all times. It is discussing those people of the book who are sometimes siding with the enemies of the Prophet. In other words, they are committing what we may call political treason. More specifically, there were certain tribes, Jewish tribes in Medina, which were siding with and helping those Meccans who were coming against the Prophet. So these kinds of verses are mainly meant for those particular tribes. The Quran also goes on to say that God does not forbid you from those people who do not fight you or those who do not kill you. God does not forbid you to interact with. Had there been a blanket statement against all Jews and against all Christians for all times, you would not have found Muslims succeeding and interacting with Jews and Christians in different parts of the world. As we are aware, Muslims were the rulers in Spain for almost 800 years. From the year of what I call the grocery store, 711, from 711 until 1492, Muslims were ruling in Spain, and they built one of the best civilization in conjunction with Jews and Christians. Similarly, we find that Muslims were not only tolerant, but also embracing an acceptance of Jews and Christians in the Holy Lands. Muslims were in Jerusalem in the year 638, and they still are in Jerusalem and in the Holy Lands. But throughout that period, most of the time they were in control until during the time of the Crusaders, but they were in control, and they were able to get along with and interact with Jews and Christians.
How were Jews and Christians treated during this period, as an example of of interfaith relations under rulers who are Muslim?
I have to be honest with you that, and this happened widely across the board, not only in the Islamic tradition, that Jews and Christians were considered as people of the book. And as I said, there was a lot of interaction with Jews and Christians, but a lot of the scholarly tradition evolved after the revelation. In other words, the Quranic verses laid out certain principles, shall we say, of interaction. The scholarly tradition then evolved based on their own needs, their own times, and what suited them. So the scholarly tradition, which comes primarily when Islam became an empire state, when Muslims were expanding their domains, sometimes, so we say, discriminated against the minorities, but it certainly did not wipe out the minorities. There was never a tradition of the Holocaust, for example, or mass exile or pogroms in Islam of either Jews or Christians or other minorities that you find, for example, what happened to the Jews in Europe. So yes, there was some amount of discrimination against minorities, but this does not come from the Quran itself. It comes from a scholarly tradition which tried to show the preponderance or the superiority of Islam over non-Muslims. And as I said, sometimes this happened in other traditions too.
And of course, there's a diversity of scholarly opinion on these questions too, I would suppose.
There definitely is, especially in modern times where Muslims are revisiting not the Quran, but the commentary on the Quran. They are revisiting and revising the scholarly traditions. So, well, these people, and even within the scholarly tradition, even the medieval times, even in the classical time, there was a lot of difference of opinion, whether these such discriminatory measures were correct or wrong. So some scholars said this, some scholars said that. It's a fascinating subject in itself, but I don't think we want to get into all the nuances there.
There is a perception out there that Islam spread violently through forced conversion. Could you say something about that?
Yeah. And I appreciate you asking these very sensitive but equally important questions. As I mentioned, the Quran comes with a very clear message. Chapter 2, verse 155, La ikraha fid din. There is no compulsion in religion. There is another verse in the Quran, chapter 10, verse 99, that if your Lord wished, everybody would have believed. If God does not force belief on anybody, who am I or anybody else for that matter to do so? So belief is a personal matter between human and the divine. Now, as for this idea that Islam spread by the sword, if we were to believe that, then how do we explain that Muslims were in Spain for 800 years? And yet there were so many Jews and Christians left that, as we are aware, the Christians finally expelled Muslims and Jews from Spain after the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition. We find this across the board, that wherever Muslims went, they were embracing, accepting Jews, Christians, and non-Muslims, and people who were not even considered people of the book. So, for example, Muslims were rulers in India for over 300 years, the Mughal Empire, until it was destroyed by the British. And yet you find that Muslims lived with Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, Buddhists, polytheists, and so on. So if Islam came to forcibly compel or convert people to Islam, how do you account for the so many different groups that Islam lived with? And this also occurs in China, for example, in Russia, in the Balkans, wherever you go. Despite this kind of lack of compulsion, freedom of worship, yes, yet we find people are converting to Islam for various reasons. Some because they want to marry a Muslim, some because of research work, for whatever reasons, people do convert. So, and I'm not saying that there were no forced conversion. You might have isolated incidents here and there, and that's wrong. I'm not condoning it. I'm condemning it because it runs against the Quran. But overall, I think you'll find that Muslims live peacefully overall with non-Muslims in different parts of the world.
You mentioned earlier that under Muslim rulers, Christians and Jews had to pay a tax. Some argue that that tax was onerous and, quotes, forced people to convert. Could you say something about that tax?
The jizya, as it's called, was levied on Christians and Jews, and it depended also on their ability to pay. They were exempt from other taxes. They were exempt from serving in the Muslim military or Muslim army. Yes, there may be cases, now it varied. There was no standard way of imposing that tax, and it may have been an implicit way of encouraging people to convert, that, well, if you don't want to pay this tax, then, you convert. But overall, I think it was a fair tax. It was not overburdening on the Jewish or Christian communities. And many a time they could appeal to the caliph if they found that the local governor was being unfair in levying taxes.
And of course, as you mentioned, there are many people who decided to pay the tax and not convert.
The majority did not convert.
Yeah. The Quran also says, also has passages about the limits to warfare, what you can and can't do. And there's a scholarly tradition in Islam about that as well. What are the limits to what you can do during warfare in the Islamic tradition?
As you said correctly, it's not only in the Quran, but also in the exegesis, in what we call the books of jurisprudence, books of fiqh, as we call them. elaborate rules on what is called siyar, not only with Christians and Jews, but even with polytheists. How do we behave with them, those who refuse to convert? So, for example, there is what is called the amana. That is somebody who is a non-Muslim and not also a Jew or a Christian who is visiting Muslim lands. He or she is given a 1-year amnesty, so to speak, so they can live in a Muslim land without any problems at all. And then that can be renewed. Now, of course, these were, as I said, instituted at a particular time in history. They are no longer applicable now. And there were also those laws on how to behave with those who signed a peace treaty with Muslims. So it wasn't like a warfare all the time. There were peace treaties, and there were different kinds of people. As far as the limits of war, as I mentioned earlier, warfare is only allowed under certain circumstances. To start with, the word jihad is not normally used for warfare in the Quran itself. In the Quran we're talking of. The word for warfare is qital, K-I-T-A-L. K-I-T-A-L literally means fighting. Harb is also used sometimes, H-A-R-B, meaning warfare. Jihad is used in a very generic sense in the Quran. That is those who strive to. And one way of striving to God is by fighting when you have to do it. All right? As far as the rules of engagement are concerned, Muslims are not allowed, even in fighting, to kill women and children, those who are old, to destroy crops or trees, or to pursue those who are running away from battle. You only fight people who are engaging you in fighting. And even if at the last moment, a person submits and say, okay, I accept Islam, I accept your authority, I'm no longer fighting you, then you do not fight them.
Terrorism is indiscriminate. It doesn't discriminate between women and children and men and people in battle. So terrorism, it would seem, goes against the teachings of the Quran.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%, because there are clear rules of engagement in warfare, as I was explaining. I totally condemn terrorism, killing of innocent civilians, because the rules of engagement are mainly for those who are fighting you. Obviously, women and children, or even innocent human beings living in building or working in buildings. You go around and knock a whole building. You're obviously going to kill innocent civilians. And I want to make a point here. Most of these terrorists kill fellow Muslims than non-Muslims. We find today that Al-Qaeda, for example, or ISIL, they put bombs in the streets of Kabul or Baghdad or Lahore, Karachi, and so on. Well, if you're going to put a bomb in the middle of the street, who are you going to kill in a Muslim country? They kill Muslims. When you go to a mosque on a Friday, who are you going to kill? So this terrorism, it does not know any boundaries, does not know any morality. It's basically their jihad is a kind of a mask for mass killing. It's totally unacceptable. Killing of innocent civilians is a new phenomenon. Suicide is totally prohibited in Islam. And I think we should also make it clear that many, many Muslim scholars have written and spoken against the 9/11 bombers or against terrorism in general. Unfortunately, the media does not carry this. So, for example, over 140 imams, leaders in North America, wrote against ISIL very clearly, against Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, saying that what you're doing in terms of killing innocent people, killing innocent civilians, remember they were beheading Western hostages and so on, that this is contrary to Islamic teaching. But yet we do not hear about it. Unfortunately, the media only reports what it wants to report.
We talked earlier about Islamophobes reading the Quran out of context, but there are also Muslim extremists who are uneducated in the scholarly tradition that we've been discussing, who also read the Quran out of context, perhaps, or don't read it in the traditional way. Would that be true to say?
Yeah, I think you bring up a very important point here. And I want to make it very clear that I'm not apologizing or I'm not defending the terrorists at all. Never.
Mm.
I'm trying to rationalize. I'm trying to think, how do they justify it?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's right or wrong is a different issue. We can discuss that. But in their view, in the views of people like bin Laden and Baghdadi and so on, they think that the West is killing Muslims. The West is attacking Islamic lands and many a time killing innocent Muslims. Therefore, we have a right to retaliate. Do you understand?
Yeah.
Because they have occupied Muslim lands, they have persecuted, killed innocent Muslims, whether it is in Afghanistan, whether it is in Iraq, whether it is in Israel, and so on. Therefore, we have a right to retaliate. We cannot retaliate in the same way as the West is doing because we do not have the weaponry, we do not have the sophisticated armaments that the West has, the tanks, the helicopters, and so on. But the only way that we can defend ourselves, in their view, is by blowing ourselves up, is by killing innocent civilians. See, Islam has also put very strict guidelines on the sanctity of life. Chapter 5, verse 32 very, very clearly says, you kill one innocent human being, you have killed the whole of humanity. You save one human being, you have saved the whole of humanity. The terrorists, of course, will ignore such verses. They assume or they claim, and again, I'm not justifying, I'm just telling you how they think, that there are approximately 124 verses in the Quran which talk of acceptance, of tolerance, of sacred sanctity of human life. They say that these verses have been abrogated, nullified, cancelled by the sword verse, chapter 9, verse 5. So one verse, in their view, cancels 124 other verses. You see what kind of a warped thinking they have. And I will go even further. As I mentioned earlier, these terrorists will stop at nothing. Not only do they kill innocent people in the West or whoever may be visiting Muslim land, they will kill innocent fellow Muslims by killing people in the streets. So, and I think we should bear this in mind, that these terrorists have killed more Muslims, far more, many more Muslims than they've killed non-Muslims. And they don't seem to have any scruples, neither do they seem to think that what they're doing is wrong. And again, we have to contextualize it, because if you look at chapter 9, verse 5, it talks about the killing of people and, wherever you find them and so on. But it also, the very next verse, chapter 9, verse 6, talks of a mushrik, which is a non-Muslim, a polytheist, not people of the book, but a polytheist. If they come to seek asylum, so here is a person who has been fighting you, and suddenly he comes to seek asylum, then the Quran says you must give them asylum and protect them because they're under your protection. And when they want to leave, make sure that they go to a place where they are safe. So I think that these are very clear indications of Muslims and non-Muslims and their trajectories as to how to behave with each other. And that sword verse, as I said, it has been misused many a time, especially by the terrorists, to vindicate and to justify their particular actions.
And again, it's referring to a very specific historical context.
Absolutely. It does that. It's very important for Muslims and for non-Muslims to approach the Quran, what I call thematically, rather than atomistically. Yeah. Atomistically means that you approach it like an atom, just one verse here, one verse there, and one verse here. Thematically means that you put all the verses together and look at the general pattern which comes out on that particular theme. So all the sword or warfare, jihad verses, plus the peace verses together. Then you'll come very clearly, you see the picture, the outline, that, well, the Quran says you kill them or you fight them because they're fighting you, etc. But if they offer you peace, the Quran goes even further, says that do not even abuse those who do not believe in your God. Those who believe in multiple gods, let alone killing them, don't even abuse them. Chapter 6, verse 108. Do not vilify or insult their gods, because if you insult their gods, they'll abuse your God. And God doesn't want you to do that.
This has been very instructive, Dr. Takim. Thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything else that you would like me to ask you about before we conclude?
Yes, I think that rather than just talking of jihad, and I gather and I quite understand this is very important, we also need to talk about not only peace, but also human relations,
yes,
of dialogue, that the Quran actually encourages people to dialogue. Okay. Chapter 3, verse 61 says that, addresses specifically people of the book, that let us come to a common word. The common word between Muslims and Jews and Christians is that one God, because obviously Muslims, Christians, Jews do not believe in the prophecy of Muhammad. Chapter 2, verse 62, chapter 5, verse 69, talks of the salvation of non-Muslims too. Contrary to what we are told that Muslims believe that only Muslims will go to heaven, I as a Muslim say I should be more worried about where I am going rather than where the others are going. It says very clearly in chapter 2, verse 62, chapter 5, verse 69, those who believe and do good deeds, those who are Jews, Christians, and Sabians are a group that's no longer extant, who believe in God and who do good deeds, there will be no harm, nor will they be worried on the day of judgment. In other words, they will be all right as long as Jews and Christians have also believed in one God and they've done good deeds. This is the essence of the Quranic message, that whoever you are, belief in God comes with good moral acts. Moral excellence, I would go so far as to say. And I also want to caution people who look at verses, for example, chapter 3, verse 85, which says, the religion of God is Islam. Here, the word Islam, and we have to understand the way the Quran is using certain words. Because the way the Quran uses certain words in the 7th century and the way that we understand those words now are very different. Islam is used not in the sense of the 7th century religion in the Quran. It is used as an act of submission to God, because a Muslim is one who submits to God, not necessarily one who believes in the 7th century religion. That's the important point to understand. Therefore, even Abraham is addressed in the Quran as a Muslim. Now, obviously, Abraham came 3,000 years before Muhammad. He could not have been a Muslim the way that I am, that I believe in the 7th century religion. But when the Quran says Abraham was a Muslim, it means that he was a submitter to one God. Similarly, the Quran addresses the magicians of the Pharaoh. You know the story of the Pharaoh and Moses. And according to the Quran, the magicians of Pharaoh submitted to God when they saw the miracle that Moses performed. And the Quran addresses them also at the time of Moses as Muslims. So when the Quran said that the religion of God is that of Islam, the word Islam here, in my understanding, does not mean the 7th century religion. It means the act of submission. The path to God is through submission to him.
That's very interesting to hear. One of the other themes in chapter number 5 that you mentioned is that because of historical circumstances, Muhammad does condemn certain Christians and Jews, but he condemns them or speaks out against them, not because they're Jews and Christians, but because they're not faithful to their own tradition. And that's a very interesting theme in that tradition, that Muhammad is imploring people to stay true to their own tradition. And that's another theme along with the ones that you mentioned that I find very interesting.
Yes, in fact, one of the duties of a prophet in Islam, any prophet, is to verify and testify of what came before him. And therefore, Muhammad, in this sense, is saying that, well, you don't have to believe in me if you don't want to believe in me, but at least be faithful to your tradition. And therefore, the Quran does say, as I mentioned earlier, that those who are believe in one God and do good deeds based on, the Quran even says that there is light and guidance in the Torah and in the Bible. So how can the Quran say there is light and guidance in the Torah, in the Bible, and then say that, that these are all man-made? Yes, it does say that there have been certain adulterations, certain changes. Not only the Quran, not only Muslim, but even Christians have said that. Christian scholars, Jewish scholars do not always say that, this is the infallible word of God as originally revealed to Moses or revealed to Jesus. But that's another story completely. Yeah. But that, at least, yes, you are right, that, when you are a Jew or a Christian or any other religion for that matter, the Quran is addressing these two because they were the main religions, apart from Islam, in Arabia at that time, that at least remain true to your beliefs and, practice the way that what you are supposed to be practicing.
So in those passages, his main concern is not to convert people, but to get them to stay faithful to their own tradition.
In those passages, yes, the general tenor is to invite people rather than convert them, for those who would like to. But invitation is different from coercion.
Yes.
Yes, that, if people may choose not to convert, then at least remain faithful to your religious tradition. Yeah. You see, also we have to remember there was quite a bit, especially with the Jews, what we may call polemics, that the Jews were attacking not necessarily physically, but in a polemic way, Muslim belief. So sometimes you see the polemics in the Quran is responding to Jewish and sometimes Christian polemics too. Yeah. And the polemical tradition, unfortunately, continues until today. All you need to do is just search the internet and you'll see what I mean.
Dr. Takim, thank you so much for this. It was very instructive. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure. I enjoyed doing it.